Welcome back, guys. Actually, I'm going to start using folks. I like that better, like Obama. Welcome back, folks. I like it. It's classy. Another episode today I recorded actually a while ago with Keith D. Travis. He is an Uber driver and a tutor for pretty much any standardized test you can take, mainly graduate and postgraduate level, but I think he does also some, I don't want to call it lower education, but you know what I mean. Brilliant guy, really critical thinker. Enjoy. I'll announce all the other stuff that we usually go at the end, how to donate, how to find me on Instagram and all that business. In the meantime, enjoy.
Welcome to The Generalist, a show with a man who knows very little bit about a lot. A man who specializes in nothing in particular. A man who knows that he knows nothing. A man who can be described as non-specific. And to top it off, he narrates his own intros. This is The Generalist with your host, Saul Ackerman.
We're actually already recording.
Okay, cool.
So, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So I wanted to talk to you because, tell me what you do, or tell the people who are listening what you do, that is.
Sure, well, I drive Uber and some of the other driving apps, and I'm also a test prep tutor, and that's my main thing. I call it a mental sport. I'm talking about graduate tests here, so people going to law school, medical school, that sort of thing.
You do not just law school, medical school, pretty much everything that I could think of you do, with the exception, obviously, of Chinese medicine, and you were looking into doing that as well, which is pretty impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, everything I can get my hands on. There are tests for architectural licensing, nursing, etc. Takes time.
Yeah. How'd you get into doing that? Like, what made you want to, I suppose, go into learning everything?
Two questions I think here. One of them pertains to the test prep, and the other one pertains to learning everything. The test prep was an accident. I was scouting out New York City and seeing what kind of employment was available here. I saw Craigslist ads for various levels of test prep teaching. I was amazed by how much work was available. In terms of learning everything, that's a really it's a much broader question, isn't it?
Of course.
I can't quite answer that directly, I think, but in terms of the test prep, a person learns to extract things very quickly from the materials that they're studying. It's not so much a test of content, it's tests of your ability to use content or extract new content and use it on the spot. So those two kind of tie well together. If a person's going to try and learn everything, they need to be able to extract.
So one of the things I was interested in talking to you about, you seem to be very into these standardized tests, if you will. And I don't know if that's something that you like, specifically standardized tests, or it's just because it's what there is. Which one is it? I'm just curious.
Because that's what there is probably the best answer here. It's the easiest way to monetize it.
I see.
But I think first and foremost is the idea of, in trying to make sense of life and taking a look at so many different types of suggestions, religions, guidance. It seems like there's a nice chance to see what everyone has to say, and in the spirit of generalizing things, it's easy to find how it seems like even diverse cultures or languages or references may be talking about the same sorts of essentials. People are trying to point at themselves and what they're experiencing, and when that starts to go beyond words, when words seem to complicate that, people try to deliver a message and let the words float out of it and leave the meaning behind. So,
how do you mean? I'm a little bit confused by what you mean by that.
Okay, let's say in a lot of Asian practices, there are semantics and mantics. Semantics are kind of like logic. There's a semantic theory which refers to how we use words, how we point at meanings directly. Here's a jar of water. I can point at it and you can see it. If I'm trying to point at something that's like an internal experience, though, there's a temptation for a person to memorize what's being talked about. If they're not able to see it immediately, they memorize the word instead of look for the internal sign. So there are mantics. Mantics are like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? A person's reflex is to try and imagine that.
Right.
And when they can't, they're left with a feeling of the absence of being able to answer that. And that feeling of the absence is the effect that's being sought.
I see. Interesting. So, as a person who went and basically started studying all these different subjects, you studied them specifically in regards to the testing, or did you study them more in general because they interested you, and then got into the testing part on the side?
Right. Testing was all accidental and incidental years down the road, and without any foresight or planning. It was just a wonderful surprise. My studies in college started very organically. I started with philosophy and found my way around that neck of the woods. That I felt pointed me towards sciences, and I think more for the language, the ability to specify and disambiguate, than to ever becoming a scientist or really discovering things on my own. It was, again, there was this sort of nature of wanting to extract information, and having access to those sorts of languages gave me that.
So I have a kind of broad question. It's a loaded question, but
Cool.
I am curious, because you're so in the educational system in some way because of the testing,
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what you think about the education system currently. I know a lot of people have issues with it, others don't. So I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Well, thank you. I grew up, my mother was a middle school teacher all my life, and I had a bit of vicarious experience by that. I enjoy working with people and have taught in a lot of different senses, but when it comes to the school system, let's say the New York public school system, I see a lot of adaptation to need, and that is generating a lot of non-traditional and unorthodox approaches, trying to fill in the demand of systematizing and standing on so many shoulders of giants. There's more giants every year, more shoulders to stand on. And I think in this day and age, especially when we've had such an exponential population growth since World War II, there's a lot of competition abroad. So we see in these years, the United States population has held about constant, just over 300 million, and the rest of the population has exploded sevenfold, from about 1 to 7 billion. And there's so much increased communication by that, and also by the advent of the internet, that we're struggling to keep up. It's like trying to cope with the growing pains of a child. And what I'm seeing in response to that are some of the tried and true approaches, which are failing. A lot of this because we are taking the public school systems and having them, I think, tend more towards catering to neurotic impulses. And
How do you mean?
well, there are a lot of communication disorders, a lot of dysfunctional communication in families, and those communication disorders are brought into the classroom and allowed to hold sway. There's a saying, if your government rules in accordance with catering to the neurotic, you're going to have a neurotic government. And so the school systems are highly pressured to cater to the neurotic, and I think they're becoming neurotic. On the other hand, we have charter schools, and those are a very interesting response, and I think we're going to see a lot more from those, and a lot more of the public school systems borrowing from the charter schools as they have their successes. We see a lot of specialty high schools and middle schools, and those are very interesting. And the charter schools have their specialties too, a lot of personalities. Some teach music or chess or Korean. They have their thing. Right. And they have a little bit more leeway to try to manage things outside of that neurotic stricture just mentioned.
A little bit difficult, or I should say, some people are not able to afford charter schools, I guess would be the way to go. To say that, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we, as a society, and again, all theoretically, obviously, I'm not asking you to solve any actual problems, but how do we as a society get charter school type education for people who cannot afford it?
Well, that's a really good question. There are a lot of fund managers, and these fund managers work for a lot of corporations. They work for colleges and universities, and I think that especially as we're seeing a lot of charter schools that become branch or chain charter schools, that if they are able to ally with each other, pool their resources towards fund managers like these universities, they will be able to, in a way, subsidize themselves. I think if they hold true to the ethical principle of teaching rather than profiteering, or possibly both, because one might actually help to influence the other for the better. I think that this that sort of finance can subsidize for people, and we do see a lot of charter schools that are subsidized for low-income families.
Oh, interesting.
I think they're very effective.
I don't know a lot about charter schools, so I'm commenting slightly from an uneducated perspective on the matter.
Oh, sure. These are different from, say, boarding schools, of course.
Of course.
Right.
Aside from that, okay, so if you were to yourself sort of make a curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
what would be the main things that you think people should focus on studying in primary and secondary school, like primary school and high school?
Oh, wow. I'm going to start this one. My own thoughts when growing up were to try and learn things for which I'd never need any tools other than what I had on my person. If it came to music, that meant singing, so I wouldn't have to carry an instrument around. And so those things, they're not very useful in today's society. They have their uses, but they're not. I don't think they're very well rounded. To adapt to society's needs today, it is a difficult question to say what in general should a person learn. The general things by themselves aren't very useful in, I think, approaching a skill by itself. Those are specialist skills. The general backdrop, though, that allow people to be healthy and communicate with each other well, to pass the baton in addition to running fast, I think those are going to be some of the more universal kinds of practices like computer skills, things like yoga, nutrition, finance, from a very early age to understand how the system works. Each of those things are vast systems, and there's only so much room for persons to become specialists in those fields, but a person able to, say, grow their own food, maintain their own health, and manage their own finances from a very early age, I think are going to be better off for it. And so the people around them better off for it as well.
I always think I'm echoing something that I've actually heard, so it's not really my original thought, but that the system that we have today for teaching is one that was made for the industrial age, which no longer applies. But more importantly, one thing that I would like to see is something more similar, not exactly, but more similar to a classical education, learning philosophy, critical thinking, things like that. So even if you don't have a particular skill or a particular, not skill, but a particular knowledge base, you can learn that knowledge base, you can critically appraise it and do things like that. And that's something that I've always thought should be included, because I wasn't taught that, even till this day, where I feel like I have some more critical thinking, some more philosophical skills. I sometimes question myself. I'm like, do I know, am I really being critical, or am I once again echoing just a different thing that I've heard?
I think when it comes to questioning whether or not a person echoes, we can look at Noam Chomsky, who developed a lot of revolutionary theories about how children develop language. He noticed that they were understanding by implication the rules of grammar. They would come up with new words on their own. They were often functional without having heard them first, and they were creating novel sentences on their own without echoing. So we are building new things out of old pieces, I think. And we're engaging that with processes that are similar, but it would be equally difficult to say whether or not a person was purely echoing something, even if you felt you were. The context, the reason why you were echoing it.
Right, of course. I'm not saying that echoing something is necessarily a bad thing, but it's good to, I suppose, notice your implicit bias or your the fact that you're echoing something and know whether you're thinking of this critically or not. And often I don't know if I do struggle with it, but I feel like I do. I feel like I'm not sure. Am I really being critical, or am I deciding on something and then justifying it afterwards?
That's interesting. I once heard a quote, 2 types of leaders. One is someone who sees where everyone else is going and gets in front of them. The other is a person who goes somewhere and everyone follows. I used to think that the person who saw where everyone was going and then got in front of them was supposed to be not so good of a leader. But I think, as it turns out, if you see a bunch of people trying to do something and they're not really doing it very well and you can help them out, well, then you're the first kind of leader. The other kind may be more charismatic, but it doesn't necessitate that they're going anywhere good, or that their intentions are good. So I think both types of thinking can be good when it comes to a person's own mind, that when especially in an age where we're thinking more about decentralized forms of identity, that parts of your mind are going places without you and you're following them. And sometimes part of your mind is focusing and the rest of it is being pulled in concert with it. So I think that a person should simply work on trying to contextualize both of those types of thinking for the better, so that either way you're going to be fine.
No, I'm sure I'll be fine.
There are a lot of things too in the body. Let's say when a person gets injured, let's say a cut, and their arteries and veins may be severed to a degree. These arteries and veins release chemical messages into the proximity of the space around them, and that gives a hint to the arteries and veins on the opposite side of the gap where to go and what direction to grow. And as they get closer and closer to each other, they kind of guess based on the concentration of these chemical releases. I think a person's thought works a lot in that way too. Unless a person is purely echoing or following instructions, I think that's how organic thought must be developing. We had another question earlier on, though. You were talking about the industrial age and
Yes,
classical
that's right.
education. Those things, let's say, in China, for example, classical education was learn how to ride in a chariot, learn archery, learn calligraphy, sports, and law, or some form of strict or rigorous thought. And those things were well and good, and they were classical. We see in the Western side of things something similar. We see learning Latin or Greek because those languages are more highly organized. And so that becomes an equivalent to learning logic or mathematics or something like that. Learning the classics, learning history, those things usually correspond to being classical. But let me ask you, what's your idea of classical?
I'm sorry, that's fair because I say classical and that's a very, very general term.
Mm-hmm.
My idea of classical goes back to what I was saying before. Learning philosophy, learning perhaps another language, whether that be I don't think Latin's necessarily a very useful language to learn
Right.
unless you're going into the medical or scientific field. And
Right.
even then, it's not that helpful. You could
I
learn
agree.
everything you need to know about Latin. So not Latin, but another language that's useful in modern society, whether that be Spanish or Chinese, Arabic, just another language because I myself am trilingual technically,
Mm-hmm.
and learning different languages, I think rewires your brains in such a way that makes you think differently. I think there's a theory, I don't remember whose theory it is, that we think the way language is spoken. So when learning different languages, you learn to think in different ways,
Mm-hmm.
which gives you some ability to critically think.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy, which again gives you the ability to critically think.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important thing, which I think all those are a part of, is learning how to learn something, learning how to approach a new subject that you've never touched before,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to learn it on your own.
Okay.
So I suppose classical education is kind of a cop out. It's a way of saying I'm not saying anything. So thank you for calling me out on that. I appreciate it.
I feel a lot of things, a lot of thoughts gathering to comment on this. Number one, it seems like the idea here is how does a person become a proficient autodidact, a self-learner? And again, this kind of belongs to the idea of extraction. How does a person evaluate themselves and say, am I critically thinking, and are the things that I'm choosing to critically think about and my results, are they really, important to my life? Psychology takes a look at life and says we have three primary drives, and those are for survival, society, and sex, or a more intimate form of society or family. And I think that if a person takes a look at those drives first and foremost and tries to adapt their process around those, it's going to be they're going to get the easiest kind of feedback, the most bang for your buck to evaluate. If I'm critically thinking about something, able to test my results.
Meaning to compare to that, how you're saying like how does sex drive this thought? How does
Yep.
society drive this thought?
Right. There's
Okay.
I think it's Finding Forrester. In that movie, Forrester talks about how poets will go to read their poetry at a cafe because they want to get laid.
Makes sense.
Right. So we have they're also doing it, you might say, because they feel that may help them with survival. They may get paid for it, and they may find themselves a little bit more accepted or accepting in society too. So those drives are all kind of there, and when a person is making a decision, if they don't feel and think that it can satisfy at least one of those drives, then they may want to reevaluate what they're thinking about. Why am I thinking about this? Is this neurotic or is this useful?
Right.
There are other models too, which take a look at how we try to decide between pragmatism and reality. Pragmatism are the things that we believe in that help us to do useful things. Those things that we believe in may not be based on something that we know or something with fact or evidence, but they lead us to make good decisions. Classic story is a person who's lost in the middle of the woods, and they say, well, I don't know where anyone else is. I need help. Which way should I go? Oh, I see some paths over here. Maybe going through those paths will lead to some place where I can find help, as opposed to just picking a direction randomly and going. We don't know there's anything at the end of the path, but it's practical. On
Right.
the other hand, in models of reality, if a person is trying to understand pure reality, as though that is going to somehow snap to some kind of omnipotence all by itself, we find that people who do that, they're not very successful. They don't satisfy those drives. They reduce them, though, and that's the other part of, I think, taking a look at your critical thinking. Can you get what you want, or can you become satisfied wanting less? And I think in both directions, we ask whichever case it is it going to be sustainable? That's a nice package to put together. Now, the question of extraction, becoming an autodidact and learning, couples also with the idea of unlearning. This is an idea brought about in Star Wars. I think most people would think of Yoda. You must unlearn what you've learned, but there are a lot of case studies now, a lot of practices where people who have, as children, become very proficient at mathematics or music or any sort of thing, still feel all kinds of micro hang-ups in the learning process where they made errors, where they were overly self-judgmental, or in any sort of thing where they felt like they might be judged or they made a mistake and winced. And so it's possible to go through with different forms of hypnosis or breathing, things which help to modulate the parasympathetic system into a relaxation response as a person goes through and is mindful of these hang-ups in process of performance or in process of calculation. A person realizes they may stop breathing, their hand may tighten. There are a lot of signs which help a person to see whether or not their process itself, the organic process, is functioning smoothly. And that is unlearning. You're telling your nerves, oh, that thing that happened before that was not okay. You're getting
It's almost like
you're freezing.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. People will start freezing, and they learn to unfreeze and allow things to allow for that sort of throughput.
It's similar to exposure in psychology, it seems like.
How so?
My understanding of exposure in psychology is they take people and they put them in those situations so they learn that the situations aren't what they think they are, right? So is that sort of what you're saying, or you're just saying, is that what you're saying, or slightly different?
It's not what I'm saying, but let's see where this goes. Okay, so with the exposure, this is to help induce learning, right?
Right.
Okay. And then I was talking about how to then unlearn.
Right. So what I'm saying
how to
is
prune back the feelings of error.
Right. So what I meant in exposure is you learned at some point in your life because of a trauma or whatever it might be that this situation is bad. Say being in a small hallway is bad, as a random example. So what the psychologists will often do, behavioral psychologists, they'll take you to a hallway and they'll make you stand there and in a sense, learn that there's nothing that's going to happen to you there. So in a sense, it's unlearning that fear.
Okay.
That's where I made the connection.
Yeah, I see the connection now. Yeah, definitely. The exposure can be, I think, a technique for that same process of unlearning. It also touches on preconception, which is a bit more direct. When a person hasn't simply made a mistake in learning, they have prevented themselves from learning outright by thinking a certain thing is so.
Right.
And so I think that can help with the preconception too.
So if you were to suggest the best way, I suppose, for you, but also if you have a suggestion in general for autodidacting, I'm not sure that's a word, but self-teaching, or self-learning. Self-learning, self-teaching, same thing. But neither of which are words, I believe. But I'm okay with that as long as people know what I mean.
I think there's a whole section in Barnes and Noble called self-learning or self-help, or
I don't mean self-help. That's slightly different. Although I suppose in a way it is self-help. What is your best strategy for approaching such a task?
The person needs to be receptive. So it's start out with, what am I interested in? A person can be disciplined, and there's a saying that experience creates desire. So if a person is trying to develop a taste for something, they need to do it, I think, with the attitude that the most important thing is to develop that taste first, the receptivity, the want to learn it. With that in place, I think that's the fundamental right there. Without that, everything else is going to slip loose. Putting some skin in the game, some kind of risk, making mistakes, those are all good ways. I don't know if you mean by this question to extend it from that base, or what should I select to learn, but we also kind of touched on that a bit.
No, I think as far as what should I select to learn definitely would be up to the singular person what they want to learn.
Okay.
I'm fascinated with his stuff because obviously the generalist. I want to learn more and have a more well-rounded. And you seem to be a guy who really has a very, very well-rounded base of knowledge.
Well, I appreciate that. When it comes to learning things, there's you can look up the word syncretism, which is a way. It's two meanings. One of which is to take a look at multiple ways of describing something and sort of pick out your way and see how are they all talking about the same thing. The same thing with philosophy or religion. How are these all talking about the same thing? How is it that these are all satisfying these common drives? The assumption that a person makes there when they're reading other people's materials is these are humans. They are satisfying their drives in some way. How are they doing it? what does this mean? If this is not if this is catharsis for them, and not some technically correct information,
Right.
to understand it in those terms. Other than that, I think a person can devote themselves to personal language. Wittgenstein talked about personal language and formal language. Math, science, logic, these things are formal. They have single interpretations. They're meant to have single interpretations. Poetry is a bit more personal, you might say. We still use rules of grammar and general spelling to format things, but the meaning of it is more what he would call mystical. It's not something that we can point at like a jar or a table. And we're pointing at a state of mind, and that state may be completely unique and transient. It may not persist in a person past the moment of having written it down. It may be catharsis. I think as a journalist, to develop your own personal language, though, and like when I make a reference from how people think, leaders following the group and getting in front of them, or people following the leader going somewhere, arteries and veins, those things, when you notice things that have in common, when you notice an underlying structure of an idea, or even if it only just makes sense to you, you create your own web.
Makes sense.
And things attached to that web. And you've got to feel more secure about your web than telling someone else about it in a formal term.
Sure. How do you make sure not to... I know you don't have all the answers to everything. I'm just asking
no,
for
this
conversation's
is
sake.
These are good stimulus.
But how do you make sure that in forming your own web, you don't get stuck in your own biases or your own ways of thinking that may be sometimes incorrect without consequence, and sometimes incorrect with severe consequences?
All these things according to context. If these consequences are personal, you can ask yourself, what are the personal consequences that I'm trying to obtain or avoid? If there's social consequences, unwanted, then I think a person needs to ask themselves, what are these, how do I define, social consequences, good and bad? And then they go through the critical thinking there. How do I live and let live? How do I obtain what I want without getting in other people's way? These questions are all very natural, and they usually stem, I think, in the spiritual sense towards things like altruism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or in Buddhism, there's the idea of bodhicitta, wanting everyone else, to become enlightened. So a person tries to become enlightened first, and they try to give other people, as much as they can, things that they will need in their own attempts to develop, and that generates a sensitivity to picking up on what is more efficacious for themselves. The way that human psychology works in that sense is very interesting. We are saying that we've evolved those who cooperate, and the brains that have cooperated seem to be pretty successful. So these mechanisms that are already built in to coordinate with others for social harmony, they definitely seem to be something that are required, and that they need to be utilized, and without them a person can't develop as an individual to their fullest potential. Confucius says there's no such thing as one human. Only when there's two or more do we call it human. Captain Kirk, Star Trek, he said to Spock, everyone's human. What did he mean by that? He didn't mean everyone is genetically human.
I'm curious as to what sort of philosophy you studied.
I started out with Chinese philosophy.
Oh, my kind of guy.
Yeah, I see some things on the walls here.
Can you read that? I can't figure it out for me.
No, I'm just learning Mandarin now.
Oh, all right.
I'm up to about 50 characters.
I know the characters. I just have no idea what it means.
I tell you what, I'm going to take a photograph with your permission.
Yeah.
And
I'll pull out the other one because there's two and it's a poem, but I can't figure it out. That one over there means longevity.
Okay.
Which people also put on their graves, but I don't mind that.
That's ironic, isn't it?
It is.
Although there's a lot of ancestor worship there, so
correct.
May my ancestors' ghost live long and prosper. Let's see. So, what was the question again?
What type of philosophy did you study?
I started with Mencius, and from there things just really ballooned. But Mencius had a way of speaking. I felt that made reference to morals. By morals, I mean what do we feel inside? Our own moral compass that says, I felt some distress, but doing this is relieving that distress. Moral compass. He was asked by a servant of a prince, Mencius, so what would you say of my master? And Mencius says, he's a good man and a true man. And the servant says, what do you mean? by good and true. And Mencius says, well, when a person knows the difference between right and wrong, we say they're a good person. When they do the good thing, we say they're a true person. And he goes on, he says, a person whose sense of goodness comes from themselves, we say, is beautiful, which implies that there are people who do things because other people think they're good and they don't really assess their own feelings about them. So, by implication, we'd say, well, those sorts of persons may be good and true, but not beautiful. The person reading this, I think, at least I did, I want to be beautiful. What does this mean? A sense of goodness coming from inside myself. And I think all that meant was, do I notice my own distress? And in my interpreting things, do I notice what the people around me might be saying? And in cases where it contrasts with how I feel about something, I won't be able to go on for very long blocking my own chi, suspending my distress. Or perplexity about something and just going through the motions. And that really helped me to gain an appreciation that philosophers do talk about things that I can find useful. So let's see here. Following that, I got into a lot of syncretic thought, and these are things like Erasmus or Giovanni Pico de Mirandola. These are people who wanted to take from all corners. And again, these are humans. So we assume, well, they must have something in common. Then they must be trying to talk about that something in common. And people who become more refined, they must have found some way from gross excesses to things which they felt were worthwhile. So either satisfying a drive or reducing it. So that really helps a lot. It helps to filter through things a lot and go about reading without the idea of memorizing what someone is saying, but about extracting whether or not that they've pointed out something novel or unique, something that relieves a bit of distress or promotes a level of excitement or energy.
Right.
Even if Wittgenstein, for example, he said, once you arrive at a new perspective in life, throw away the ladder that got you there. So it's not because so-and-so said something that something is right. It's because you feel good about it that makes it right for you, like wine.
Sure.
And wine tasting. So I'm not sure if I'm getting to your question about
it's fine. It's interesting, and I actually have a follow-up from what you're saying.
Good. Let's go with that first.
Yeah. What do you say to somebody who feels good about doing things that are, I don't want to say objectively bad, because it's hard to say when something is objectively bad, in my opinion anyway, but that seem at the very least bad, or that hurt a large amount of people, the opposite of altruism. They're doing that thing that you're saying is beautiful, but they're doing it because it makes them feel good that they're doing this thing that's bad.
It's a very good question. Those people are going to be interacting with others, and those others are going to determine ultimately whether or not how to interact with a despot or a tyrant, and that's what we call that sort of psychotype. And these things, we could talk about them all kinds of ways. Are they results of dissociative identity disorder, or are they forms of megalomania, all these sorts of things? To pin it down, the question is, should we appreciate their beauty, or should we stifle it?
Right.
In these cases where the effect is harmful on too many people, and I'm going to refer back to a sort of organic kind of mindset here. In your own body, you have an immune system, and society, being made up of so many individuals collaborating, I think has its own immune system in a way. It tries to adapt to, assimilate, and or reject what is going on if a cell becomes overly dangerous. It promotes its own cell death. So in the case of a tyrant, the idea is, the society is going to pressure to repurpose that sort of person rather than to try to create a bubble or a tumor, you might say, around them. So they would. That's called prison, actually, where they can do no harm and continue to live. The idea about imprisoning people, I think it's a numbers game. It's an organic game where we're multicellular creatures, and if we didn't operate in that way, that makes sense. We wouldn't be able to thrive as a society. So I think trying to repurpose, trying to communicate with, or at least keep ourselves well protected from, persons whose beauty as such endangers us, is a natural thing. We call ourselves humans because we can stop and pause for a moment and communicate. And persons who seem unwilling or incapable of stopping and pausing and communicating for a moment are a threat to that system. If they are not developing a system more stable than that one, then there's going to be distress, and people are going to do what they need to do to relieve that distress, whether it's right or wrong.
Won't there be that same distress even if they are developing a better system, or allegedly better? Take, for example, the switch from monarchy to democracy, right? In the United States, for example. There's going to be distress. People are upset. If you are developing this new system, you're going against the old system. So they're going to try and imprison you. They're going to try and get rid of you, if you will.
The differences here are in the number of the degree of communication. A tyrant doesn't communicate. He tries to force, tries to get things done by say-so rather than by context and agreement. Democracy would never work if there weren't people collaborating on it, and if that collaboration didn't spread. Like a pool of mercury, drop by drop, and those pools collect, and pretty soon they might push out a pool of water or oil that had been there before. Something like a monarchy or a tyranny doesn't involve much communication. It involves putting off communication, forcefully doing something, and leaving the consequences for others to bear. And so I just think it's inherently unstable, because other people don't know how to work with that. They don't have a heads up. Without being able to communicate, we're not as stable.
On the other hand, you do have examples of particular monarchic leaders who were great and their societies were great, and there certainly are. I'm not saying there's a better system than democracy at the moment, but there certainly are issues with democracy. Take, for example, Marcus Aurelius as a philosopher king, and obviously he wasn't perfect, but generally I believe he was well liked, and he tried to do good by the people. At least it certainly seems so. Versus issues, I mean, I believe it's in blanking on the name, the historian, the first historian.
Oh yeah,
what's his name?
I'm blanking on your blank. I know who you're talking about though. Herodotus.
Herodotus, yes.
Herodotus.
I just pronounced it that way. I don't know which way is the right way.
I think you're right. It's smoother that way.
Yeah. So Herodotus, I think it was in Herodotus, where there is a conversation about the problems with democracy, and it's really interesting because they point out that, for example, a monarchic leader can do, assuming he is a good leader, can do what's best for the people without having to go through a bureaucracy. While in a democracy, you not only have to go through a bureaucracy, or at least in this is not a Herodotus thing because they didn't have the same type democracy that we had, that we have, I should say. But you have to go not only through the bureaucracy of making a decision, but through all the people and all the opinions, and often those opinions are good, but sometimes those opinions are actually more of a hindrance to a positive process. You have to keep the mob happy, which I guess is also to some degree true in a monarchy, but somewhat less so.
I think all these things can be addressed with a few ideas. One of them is that a large brain, like a large government, can't make small decisions quickly. In the development of our own nervous system, we have our brain stem. We have our spinal cord, and that's to make snap decisions. But not every decision is a snap decision. Look before you leap. If you have time to look.
Right.
Sometimes when there's not time to look, we need to make decisions at the pace of life rather than at the pace of agreement. And so I think that in looking to elect a leader, or for, let's say, a monarch, what have you, that purpose there is analogous to that function of the brainstem. Who do we want to act as our brainstem?
Right.
Is this community? And then for so many of these other processes that work along longer time scales and need sounder planning, that those are also engaged. Even monarchs and tyrants and dictators had their advisors and sub-advisors, and those persons were, to them were delegated the matters of handling state affairs, because that's a leader can't really be expected to be able to make decisions and be well informed about those things at their paces, and still sort of keep their finger on the pulse of that brainstem analog, being alert, being aware for the sorts of things that do need quick decisions.
Right. So the more you allow for those quick decisions in a democracy, or again, specifically in our democracy, I don't think our system was designed that way. For the president, for example, to be able to, of course, to some degree make quick decisions, but the power of the president has, in my opinion, increased substantially in the 20th century, especially after the invention of nuclear weapons. So they're able to make those quick decisions. That's how we decided it should be. But in the past, I believe that even a decision, for example, the decision to go to war was not allowed to be made by the president. It had to be made by Congress. And sometimes that is a snap decision. So how do you deal in a democracy with that sort of situation? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go into politics. It's just interesting to me.
No worries. Instead of thinking of it as politics, I think of it as heuristics. Those are rules of thumb or policies. So we have these checks and balances. Well, I don't think anywhere there is absolute power, but there is an ability to engage a decision by one party and an ability by the other party to veto it. And then there are even limitations on that ability to veto. And a person, I think, can ruminate or reflect about their own decisions and realize, what am I leading with my head, my heart, my gut, which drive? Your own drives check and balance each other a little bit. So when it comes to the powers of the presidency, legally, yes, they may have increased somewhat, but the presence of those checks and balances are still in place. I think that these things may develop a little bit out of sync with the times, especially these times where there's so much advance in technology and communication. But the checks and balances are still there. The problem is, I think, are the groups capable of vetoing the president able to collaborate amongst themselves effectively?
Certainly doesn't seem so.
Right. So, well, if they're not, there is a strong temptation to sort of abdicate that power and say, let's give that to the president. And I think you probably agree that what we start to see more and more is, let me make a few decisions, and you guys just say no if you don't want it.
Yeah.
If you can agree to say no.
Although that's how you sort of centralize power a little bit, no?
It is. Without, I think, the discipline to keep the eye on the ball, and what's the bigger picture, that groups, instead of deliberating about whether or not it's a good or a bad idea to say yes or no to, they may be simply jockeying for power, to say, well, who else in my party am I agreeing or disagreeing with? Who cares about what the decision was?
Right.
Where am I in the pecking order here?
Yeah. The other problem, I think, in terms of that is that the way that we select our leaders, and I don't mean just the president, I mean also people from Congress, is not really about who's going to be the best person to make these decisions, but today seems to be more about who's going to be the best at finding funding, at fundraising. And that's problematic too, because we put in people who are not necessarily the people we agree. Often it's a popularity contest, especially for the president. And I'm not talking, by the way, specifically about Trump. I'm talking about pretty much most of the presidents in the 20th century and 21st century so far, maybe even somewhat before that. Especially starting, I think, the famous story is Kennedy and Nixon, of the televised debate versus the radio debate, where everybody who heard it on the radio thought Nixon won, and everybody who heard it who saw it on TV thought Kennedy won. All these, and more it's become, I imagine, I don't know this for a fact, people are standing there telling you exactly what to wear, exactly how to look, exactly everything that you could do to make it seem best, and we end up selecting the people who win a popularity contest versus the people who we think are going to be the best leader, or really not leader, servant should be the right word for the country.
I think this can be addressed with the same brainstem analogy. The popularity contest, I think, is one of who can we make flinch,
right?
Whoever doesn't flinch, those are keepers for the brainstem job.
Interesting.
You don't want to have a brainstem that's just flying off the handle. It needs to
that's
have
an interesting point.
Nerves of steel.
Yeah.
There's a saying, not a saying. There's a principle behind, let's say, gunslinging. The person with the cool hands, with the steely eyes, they're the person with the more refined brainstem. They may not know it directly, but a part of them has become conditioned to realize that if they draw as a reflex, they will be faster than the other person.
Right.
The other person who is acting out of, say, fear or deliberation is not able to engage their nervous system in the same way. They're trying to activate it from a less direct route than from the brainstem. So you let the other person draw first. That triggers your own reflex, which is going to be faster than that person.
Right.
So the ability to monitor a situation without fear, to be circumspect about it, and then make a quick decision, and keep your cool, and a good one, keep your cool under fire. These are all qualities of, I think, brainstem that can be, I think, misunderstood or much more easily talked about as being popularity. But the underlying drive, the critical thinking underneath it all, I think belongs more to that picture of things.
That's really interesting. I like the way you put that. I'm going to jump onto a different subject because I don't want to stay on politics too long.
All right.
I'm actually curious to see what you think about consciousness. What do you think is consciousness? I know that's a very broad question. I could be more specific if you like.
That's all right. No, I read a lot about consciousness. I'm going to refer back to early in our conversation where you mentioned, how do we think about things?
Right.
How does our language seem to guide and or perhaps block us from considering things in certain lights? And above all, I think when we say something like consciousness, the mind really does say that's a noun. A noun is a person, place, thing, or idea. It does. Well, it's consciousness. Is it a noun? Let's have some fun with that.
Yeah, let's.
All right. So is it an idea? Who wants to walk around and say my consciousness is an idea as opposed to a real or somewhat more solid and direct experience of something? Like, why not? It's not an idea. Is it a thing? Yeah. Well, where is it? I don't know. Is it a person? Well, let's go back to person in a second. And is it a thing? And that's kind of like a place. Well, I still can't point at it. Heck, I can remove sections of my brain or interfere with them electronically, and I still have consciousness is still there. Even saying consciousness is still there, the language wants to say there. Where was it?
It's a good example of the idea that language changes the way we think. But yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think this is the sort of thing that's often talked about, and the impulse to grasp, and when we're using words, and a person's trying to grasp the meaning of the words, and this is again why we have some semantic things to help ungrasp. So let's go back to person, place, or thing. Is consciousness a person? We might say that it is, but there are persons who don't remember that they're a person. But there's still consciousness, experience of things, sensation, thought, but there may be amnesia. There may not be identity.
Right.
So we regard them from, you might say, the outside as being a person. We treat them with the respect due to a person, but they don't have the identity of a person. So we're starting to see the nature of trying to go and sort of establish what are we talking about and what are we not talking about with consciousness. We are not talking about something we can point at. The Buddhists have another saying. They say, even in the most deep and subtle meditation, there's no golden glowing dot that says you are here.
Right.
If consciousness did belong to something like the brain is distributed across billions and billions of neurons, and so it's not any one of those, and not all of them are necessary. And if it's a transient thing, then your consciousness, your identity changes by the second as new nerve extensions grow or diminish. So the word consciousness seems to be a static thing, but it definitely seems like a processional thing. If you were to freeze any moment in time, it would not seem as though there were any consciousness in that instant of time, that it requires noticing a difference from one moment to the next in order to qualify. So consciousness definitely seems to be a part of a living process in time, and it's not an abstract thing like an instant. As we go across and continue to think about that, I'm much more fond of the notion that it's an emergent property of the biological processes, that it's not the sort of thing that can be put into a bottle, and it may not be the sort of thing that can be simulated with electronics.
So you don't think that, for example, artificial intelligence is possible?
I think artificial intelligence is possible.
Not artificial consciousness.
Correct.
Interesting. All right, go on. I'm sorry.
No, quite all right. There's a Turing test. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, the Turing test.
Okay. Yeah, the idea there is that an artificial intelligence would be... It could
able to fool people that it's...
Yeah. It could
conscious,
pass the
basically.
Turing test without being conscious. It could make intelligent decisions. It could increase future options and possibilities, by modifying what's going on in the present. So it could easily be intelligent. But I think the consciousness itself, I think it's a phenomenon that's related to more to the organic processes in matter that give rise to it, rather than any specific object or structure. Now, there's an idea about a boat. If you had a boat in a shipyard, it was old and you wanted to fix it, and you took out its beams and nails one by one and replaced them, and into the dock right next to it, put those beams and nails right back together again. you would end up with two boats, one that was made up of all the old beams and nails, and then the new one which had replaced it, which
is the original boat. Yeah.
Right. So we can do that. We're getting to the point where we can stitch together DNA and propagate cells, and even without that, just regular procreation. It is our creation of, you might say, a body which then gives rise to consciousness. So these things are interesting.
Very.
If it were a matter, I think, of creating artificial consciousness, I think it would have to belong to the notion that consciousness exists as some kind of field independent of bodies. That what we are is like antenna or something, which, when placed into the right field, like if you place iron into a magnetic field, that field of consciousness somehow magnetizes.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you.
Right.
I was going to bring that up because I know that there's this idea that perhaps the brain, perhaps not the brain, but likely the brain is an antenna more than it is an abode of consciousness.
Right. So if we're going to think about antenna, the idea is, well, does that mean that there is something broadcasting on a station and that every brain picks it up? Or is it simply that it stirs to life the structures in the brain, and each one, once stirred to life, goes about with its own sort of momentum and integrity. It would be like saying with magnets in a magnetic field, bars of iron. In a magnetic field, the field is ubiquitous, but each piece of iron that you might place into it would have different qualities and strengths depending upon its shape and so forth. It's way too gross an analogy, though, because I think of just how complicated the brain is. I don't think that there's a singular transmission. I just think that there is a high degree of similarity of structure, and so that it seems convenient to say there may be some universal transmissions. But what we are actually saying is that just because our own physical underpinnings are so similar to one another, we so easily grasp, usually, what other people are trying to say and do, that rather than go into the nitty-gritty of it, we simply say, oh, it might be coming from that transmission, rather than from ourselves. Each of us, like the child with the language, creating and inferring, rules that are working that another person can grasp, even though we hadn't heard them before. We are built to develop the same sorts of things in advance.
So do you think that there is a way to tap into a larger portion of this consciousness, let's say, if it is an antenna and it is something that's, again, not necessarily being broadcast, but a field? Could you potentially tap into this larger consciousness? And I don't know what that would look like or what that would do, if that would make you understand more, or if that would just give you more brain power, for lack of a better term.
Good questions. I'm going to start differentiating again here between things like awareness and consciousness. So suppose that consciousness to a person was a feeling of satisfaction, and that was the goal. They may not need a lot of brain power. They just need to feel all right with what they're doing in the world. Meditation often focuses a person to reduce the other drives and the activities so much to become a very tranquil person. The metabolism is efficient. The mind is not noisy. They don't need a whole lot of brain power to do that. They don't need to be Superman at all. So that steers the conversation in one direction, and I think that based upon what I've read and experienced, that to expand the consciousness in that direction, to reduce the drives and satisfy them, leads to not a greater awareness. It leads actually to a less awareness.
Interesting.
Less noise, less distraction, a greater degree of sort of direct sublimity, a bit more free of thinking and sensory stimulation. All these things seem to be what bother the brainstem.
It's interesting because I've heard of the same sort of situation described, but if you think of it in relative terms, you have a certain amount of input, and if you quiet out the other input, then the input you're focusing on, let's say, would expand, sort of like the idea of a blind person being able to hear better.
Okay, that's interesting. If a person is listening to their own processes, their own feelings, and those currents and movements, a person needs to be free, more and more free from external sensory data. So yes, in those cases, and the yogis call it pratyahara, that's where a person sort of first becomes like tunnel vision, and then things begin to fade. Sensory data begins to fade, and the person begins noticing their heartbeat. They notice subtle changes in their emotional state, little bits of annoyance at how they may be sitting or needing to adjust. And once more and more of these external stimuli and these gross peripheral stimuli are attended to or relaxed, the more and more a person can start noticing things like their organs and their blood flow. They can start noticing, you might say, some of the subtleties amongst all those different sub-organs in the brain. And they can notice thoughts coming and going. And that sort of thing also starts to become kind of like a periphery. And a person tries to collect to a single point. And not so much quieting those things, but developing, you might say, a taste for reducing their drives also. Letting them run smooth and easy and not be easily reactive to even a person's own thoughts. You've had dreams before. I know I've woken up thinking that I'm about to kick a soccer ball and jerked my foot into the air as I woke up.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of consciousness that's developed in one direction. And what a person gains, I think, by that is very social. They're able to observe other people and more directly understand the nature of their noise.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you think... Oh, sorry. You were going to say something else?
That's just the one direction. The other one, superpowers, brain, stuff like that.
Of course.
We can address that if you want.
Oh, I would love to. Let's do that.
Okay, so you want to start it off. What do you mean by
well, let me put it in a not too crazy way, but the idea of having intuition or connecting to your subconscious and having subconscious.
It's not subconscious.
Oh, because it would be conscience. I see.
Subconscious. Yeah.
I did not know that. Thank you.
No worries.
So connecting to your subconscious and being able to do things that seem unnatural, or predict things, or I don't mean predict to the sense of like being a psychic, but just seeming to react better to everything around you, or even being able to determine things that you would otherwise not be able to determine.
Okay, I'm going to split this one again into those things which belong to the first discussion, and those things which belong to, let's say, objects.
Right.
And by the way, I kind of exaggerated she/us. It's more like shus. Most importantly,
subconscious.
Yeah, shus.
Got it.
Leave the N out. Good.
Thank you.
Sure. So when it comes to anticipating people, I think that belongs, to the first category of things, the developing the consciousness by the sort of meditation processes. When it comes to anticipating the results of studies, mathematics, things which belong to more abstract and deliberate processes. Did you want to go in those directions?
Yeah, absolutely.
With most every single subject, even mathematics, there's a place for the intuition, absolutely. And it seems that even with the mathematics, that what is being described are things that the brain can recognize. And why would the brain have ever developed to recognize things that can't be recognized? There's an innate feeling that whatever we are perceiving in some form, whatever is arising into our mind in some form belongs to the natural world. It may just belong to our own natural world, but it's a something, whatever it is. There's a famous Indian mathematician. There's a movie about him recently. The name might come to mind, but his equations, almost 50 years later now, without having known in advance what they might be useful for, are describing the mechanics and behaviors of objects in motion around black holes. So there are equations that people find and derive that later on have a use. The curve of a wire that's slung between two poles is called a catenary, and the equation for it existed long before we realized that it could describe the curve of that wire. So a lot of with mathematics, we are it seems like we are able to learn from ourselves. If we are able to keep track of all the things that a mind is capable of doing, all the things that a mind is capable of doing is keeping track of the natural world.
Right.
Good. So Everything else is like that too. The yogis call it samyama when they talk about science or trying to infer the underlying nature of an object or a process to try to anticipate or predict what's going to happen. But that leads a lot to what we call pseudoscience, alchemy.
Sure.
Where I think a lot of our we have a lot of fictions or ideas that are meant to impress or dazzle other persons without understanding the underlying mechanism. Sometimes we're right, but right for the wrong reasons, and we discover that later on or in hindsight. Understanding the fundamental nature of things with, say, like chemistry or energy are very interesting. Things want to return to their lowest state. Water wants to return to its lowest state. Electrons want to return to their ground energy state.
So it's very Taoist philosophy-like.
It's very Taoist philosophy-like. However, at the same time, right, like with yin and yang, there is the dynamic force counterposed with that, which is releasing energy. It's the yang.
Right.
And that released energy is absorbed by the yin. An electron in orbit around a nuclei absorbs light. The whole atom expands and then contracts again and releases light.
Right.
Or heat or whatever it is. And so I'm trying to remember where we were going with this.
Superpowers.
Okay. So I think a person who's able to reset, they're able to maintain a lot of activity and they're able to reset quite easily. It's easy to go for a hike all day long, but if you can't rest at the end of the day and go do it again the next day, your output's not going to be very good overall. Well, there's a lot to say about a lot of geniuses that they don't necessarily have good ideas, they just have lots of them.
I see.
And then there are the sorts of persons who are able to develop their insight. They're able to, I think, critically think and ask themselves, so what? Does this actually pertain? The mathematician who came up with the notions about the black hole didn't ask himself that question, but simply had faith that whatever it was, he had confidence that his process was leading him to observe and sort of remark about something natural. Maybe someone else would figure out just what that was. So if a person isn't too concerned with whether or not something's going to be immediately useful in their own lifetime, that should be fine.
Right.
Some things are going to be like that.
So to go to like more superpowery things that are obvious, take for example a guy by the name Wim Hof. You ever heard of him?
No.
Wim Hof is a guy, they call him the Iceman. He goes and runs around in snow, climbs Kilimanjaro, all in his underwear. They've measured everything he does scientifically. He's able to actually teach these techniques to other people.
Okay.
And it's all about, and it's not just cold. Cold is what he generally does it in, but he's done a marathon in the desert. I think it was a marathon in the desert with no water. He swims under polar, I think it was polar ice caps, but he went swimming for, I think it was 50 meters under frozen water. His retina actually froze, but he's fine. He's able to, through a technique of breathing, not only do it himself but teach it to other people. They injected, I think it was I don't want to say exactly what it was, but because I don't remember, but I think it was a toxin, and they had 12 people. They did a trial. 12 people that were trained by Wim Hof injected with this toxin, or maybe it was ingested. I don't remember if it was injected. And 12 people who were not trained. Now, obviously, it wasn't a toxin that was going to kill them, and I think it was probably a dead bacteria, if I had to guess, so that the body would react to it, but it wouldn't necessarily cause any real issues. Okay. Again, I don't remember exactly. The 12 people who were trained by Wim Hof were able to not have any side effects from this, while the 12 people who were not trained by him had side effects, every single one. And it was 12 and 12 perfectly. He takes people with heart problems, 70-year-olds to climb Kilimanjaro every year in their underwear. And he's able to teach this. So again, all scientifically backed thus far. So how do you explain things like that, I suppose?
Parasympathetic again.
That's how he explains it as well, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The nervous system, those quick snap decisions, those sorts of things, called the reticular activating system, and it sends messages all down the spinal cord. And it's what happens when we say, okay, let's pool our blood resources. Let's pay attention to our muscles and our eyesight, and let's shut down things like the digestive system. We don't need to digest that food right now. Let's throw it up, maybe crap our pants.
Right.
Or whatever. We don't. It's not a bad thing. It's like we just need to get rid of it. It's dead weight right now. So that can be useful.
Yeah.
But it really is an old system, you might say, evolutionarily speaking.
Right. Makes sense.
I think people feel a bit more directly intimate with it when they take a look at it, and so they feel like maybe there's something more real about it, because sometimes we live in a society where we kind of fake it till we make it, and then we realize that we never made it with a lot of behaviors that we were faking.
Right.
And so we try to get back to the basics, and so it's easy to do that with the brainstem. But I think that it is an old system, and there have been improvements, and we also need to develop those improvements.
Right.
And that's what our ability to use our brain to create a simulation for the brain stem to maintain its parasympathetic mode. We can recontextualize the environment, what's going on. We can project. We can see what's the bigger picture here. One person may freak out, where another person sees that it's not really a big deal, and the other person is more successful for that reason. Now, just the opposite, failing to act when it's necessary, right, can get a person in trouble. But I think overall that if being able to not freak out hadn't been so successful, life wouldn't have developed in that direction. So back to not freaking out. The parasympathetic system is the don't panic system.
Right.
And by understanding the sorts of things which tease the brainstem into wanting to react to something, again, with like meditation or breath control, a person learns a more direct sort of control over them. Breath control is used to monitor oxygen and carbon dioxide. Essentially, a person, if they're holding their breath, feels like they need to breathe, but they don't know if they need more oxygen or if they need to get rid of their carbon dioxide at first.
Right.
It all feels like the same mush of sensation. Person starts training that by restraining their breath, breathing slowly, exhaling slowly, and developing an understanding of what's going on with that. And as they do so, they are at the same time training their nervous system to have a more direct control. They're more smoothly moderating that switch. So once a person has done that, in the yogic system, it's considered to be the gateway to all the higher functions. Once you're able to more closely observe what things are being dominated by the brainstem function, you're able to take over those things with the limbic and the cortex systems by using them to create a simulation for the brainstem, you might say, to tell the brainstem it is in such and such an environment, rather than in the environment that is trying to directly react to. The eyesight, for example, is more directly wired to the brainstem than to the cortex. A person can have nerve damage and be blind, functionally blind, but if they are led down a hallway with objects strewn on the floor, they
don't hit them. Yeah.
They don't hit them. It's called blind sight, and that results from the brainstem taking that input and making decisions even without it coming into
That's so
consciousness.
interesting.
Right.
Do you think that whole concept is a little bit, I don't want to say ignored, but yeah, actually I'm going to say ignored in modern medicine?
Yeah,
Obviously it's being studied.
In modern medicine, anything that requires the active participation of the patient is definitely given less importance in modern medicine. Modern medicine definitely focuses on, regardless of what the patient does, this is going to work. So, but the other aspect of modern medicine, preventative medicine, mindfulness, learning about those things, I think it's definitely emerging. I think a lot of that too is because with rising costs and worries about how much of a complication that's going to be, people are taking it seriously. They see modern medicine not as unsuccessful but an inconvenience.
Right.
If they can solve it themselves, I think that's a good attitude for people who are taken by surprise.
Yeah.
Or must suffer accidents. Modern medicine is there to treat someone who may be a vegetable, who can't respond.
Oh yeah, I'm not shitting on modern medicine.
No, that's all right. But moving with the notion of is humanity as a whole paying more attention to these things? Yes, I think they are. There are additional studies of people who can cause themselves to induce tumors and then relieve those tumors just by making their blood more or less acidic with a retention or a expulsion of the carbon dioxide in their system. You've probably heard about alkaline diets.
Yes.
It's an interesting notion. It's a much less complicated way than to tightly control all of your food intake. You can get a carbon dioxide sensor or blood pH sensor, and you can practice your breath control and monitor how.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing.
Carbon dioxide can lower can raise the alkalinity.
Yeah, that's another thing that Wim Hof talks about breathing so that his body is alkaline. Right. And he's able to do all these things that way, which is interesting.
It's effective, and it's something that you can see without having to convince yourself.
Right.
that you're doing it right.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
Huh. Yeah. Well, carbon dioxide sensor will run you about $300, $400.
That's why I've never thought of it.
Right. pH. But yeah, once you're on the right track, it becomes like most things. You then have a direct awareness of it, and you can work with that.
Right. All right, I'm gonna call it. We're gonna stop it, but I want you to first promote yourself. How can people get in touch with you if they want tutoring from you? If you want to, of course you don't have to, but you're more than welcome to. I would suggest not giving a phone number, just because I don't know who's listening and who's gonna be an asshole and try to call you for no reason. But maybe an email or something like that, or I could put your card up. It's up to you.
I think I may just give you my card to put up.
Sure.
Because I hadn't really thought about that, and too many questions about how many viewers are out there and that sort of thing. But I'd be happy to put that up for people who are really interested in furthering this. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, let's call it. We'll talk about you getting your own podcast started after we take it off, and then hopefully if you do, I'll have you back on and we'll promote your podcast.
Hey, awesome. All right. Hey, thank you very much, Saul.
No, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Let me pause this right here. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Couple of things, same stuff as always. If you'd like to help us out with the show so that we can make more shows more often, put them out quicker, all that business, help us by donating at our website, thegeneralistpodcast.com/donate, or just go to the main page and click through the donate link. You can donate with Bitcoin, you can donate with PayPal, you can, I don't know, figure different ways to donate. You can also shop with our Amazon link, which would give us a kickback, which I hear is a bad word. I think I said that already once, but I don't care. You know what I mean. It doesn't cost you anything. We make some money off of it. So that'd be cool. Especially if you're buying one of the books that we mentioned in any of the podcasts. It's always under the episode notes. If you buy it through those links, we make even a little bit more. Still at no cost to you. So really appreciate it if you do that. If you want to follow us, The Generalist Podcast, or I should say at The Generalist Podcast is our Instagram. It is our Facebook, I guess. We also have our Twitter is The Generalist PC, because it wouldn't let me do the whole Generalist Podcast, and somebody had already done it. And if you want to email us, have any questions, have anything to say, any comments, anything interesting, thegeneralistpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you soon. Many more episodes coming.